Welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian. We recently published the second issue of EVN Security Report, a monthly security briefing providing data-driven, in-depth analysis of Armenia's security situation by Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. This month's issue is titled Hybrid Warfare and the Asymmetrical Disparity. Dr. Kopalyan joins me now to provide further analysis and insights. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Thank you for having me, Maria.
Last month, you wrote that Armenia, lacking military deterrence capabilities, resorted to intense diplomatic initiatives to bring international attention to bear on Azerbaijan. You coined it the diplomatization of security, which, by the way, is now being used in public discussions on television and on social media platforms. This month, you wrote that diplomatization of security as a stopgap doctrine temporarily contributed to the diminishing threat. However, the security dilemma continues to persist for a number of reasons. The first is Azerbaijan's superior military capacity, the disparity in hard power, and Baku's capacity to operate from a position of strength, mitigating the extent to which Armenia can continue to rely on the doctrine of diplomacy as security. So as I said at the top, our October issue is called Hybrid Warfare and the Asymmetrical Disparity. Can you please provide us with a deeper understanding why hybrid warfare is dangerous to Armenia's security architecture?
So what we have realized is, generally speaking, Azerbaijan's military doctrine is defined more by hybrid techniques than full-scale military incursions or invasions. And obviously that's very, very easy to observe. But the broader objective is that hybrid warfare and wide-scale warfare by Azerbaijan are part of the same doctrine. There's a continuum in how they operationalize one and then align it with the other. So just because, for example, we don't have a wide-scale invasion into Artsakh or into Armenia proper, does not mean that the situation is quote-unquote relatively stable. Because what may be perceived as a period of stability is actually a continuous period of a different type of warfare, and this is hybrid warfare. So hybrid and asymmetrical warfare is a method Azerbaijan continuously uses. So even if we don't have wide-scale fighting taking place, it doesn't change the fact that you have continuous attempts, to target Armenian soldiers. Overarchingly, the relationship between wide-scale warfare and hybrid warfare are actually quite closely aligned. And in the continuum of the broader military doctrine Azerbaijan uses, they tend to fluctuate from one to the other. In this context, why is hybrid warfare so dangerous for Armenian security architecture? Well, whenever we see periods where there are no wide-scale incursions or active military activity by Azerbaijan, we assume that there's, quote, relative stability. What does that entail? Relative stability generally entails that you do have a continuous process of war taking place. It's a different type of war. And this is the hybridity factor and the asymmetrical factor that we're discussing. So just because we don't have cases where, Azerbaijan is shelling Armenian population centers, or they're not attacking positions consistently, or invading Armenia proper or Artsakh, it doesn't mean that we have a period of peace. And so, broadly speaking, with the exception of the 4-day war in 2016 and the 44-day war in 2020, much of Azerbaijan's aggression towards Armenia has taken a hybrid formality. And they fluctuate between these hybrid techniques, or what are known as gray zone tactics, where these fluctuate between Cold War techniques but short of a full-scale hot war. And so when Armenia observes these developments, it's important to understand that just because you don't have a full-scale hot war doesn't mean things are stable. Does not mean that our security architecture is not threatened. This is why hybridity is extremely important, and for Armenia's security architecture to consider important nuanced doctrines that could be developed to counter Azerbaijan's, what has been for a long time, a rather successful hybrid warfare doctrine against it.
Right, you write that Armenia is, and in the near future will be, in this perpetual state of Cold War, regardless of formal peace arrangements, and flaring up into hot war or full-scale conflict. Would we have indicators of when that would happen, or taking into account what has taken place since the end of the 2020 Artsakh war?
So the modality hybrid warfare changes based on Azerbaijan's political objectives. So the reason why we use the term hybrid warfare is because it is also aligned with political developments, posturing developments. So it's not specific only to military factors. And so when we talk about, for example, Azerbaijan's endeavor of caviar diplomacy or coercive diplomacy, these are all hybrid tactics. So how do we understand the transition from hybrid techniques, gray zone asymmetrical techniques, to full-blown warfare? And these tend to fluctuate from time to time. There are some indicators, given forecasting modeling allows us to observe that after certain modalities of behavior that Azerbaijan engages in, such as, for example, a continuous and methodical misinformation warfare, or accusatory content that's not consistent with reality. Those are indicators, but doesn't mean those indicators are always consistent. When we align those with certain other factors, such as how the negotiations are going, for example, or the fluctuation in Baku's demands during negotiations, where they go from basically from their lens, reasonable demands to maximalist demands, but those also change the coercive configuration. So there are a lot of factors that can indicate where we transition from hybridity to hot or full-scale warfare. But fundamentally, full-scale warfare is also resource-intensive and very expensive for Baku. Aside from military usage, they have to implement their diplomatic pressure, they have to justify their behavior, they have to go into full-scale national crisis mode to justify what they're doing internationally, and also continue their operations against Armenia. So hybridity gives them a lot of flexibility, and it's also a lot less expensive in resources. So between those configurations, those factors, what we're realizing is they have been utilizing hybrid warfare against Armenia since pretty much 2010. Well, Armenia has only been preparing for wide-scale war, but has not had any serious answers to this hybrid doctrine.
Since 1994, the end of the First Karabakh War, there were terms being coined: no war, no peace. We were living and lulled into this notion of relative peace, even though there were incursions and there were, skirmishes on the border, the worst being in 2016, and even before that in 2013 and 2012, whether it was, near Davush, even on the state border, but primarily in Artsakh. Now, you write that the notion of peace has no substantive meaning, an asymmetrical phenomena that defines warfare. And let me say, this text was a little dense for me, so this is why we're trying to untangle everything that you're trying to explain. Can you please explain what you mean by this?
Right. Kind of to simplify it, Armenia has to, and Armenian society, not just government, or the Armenian nation globally as well, we need to reconfigure and reconceptualize what constitutes peace with Azerbaijan. For example, Armenia has peace with Turkey. Okay, there's always a threat from Turkey, but Turkey does not carry out concerted operations against Armenia, whether it's in the hybrid realm or whether it's in the this realm or that realm. They mostly engage in blockade and economic factors, and sometimes engage in information warfare. Why do I bring up the Turkey example? So we could draw a comparison. So as much as Turkey is a threat to Armenia, relative peace is attained with Turkey. Relative peace is not attained with Azerbaijan. So the relations that we have with Azerbaijan is a continuous state of warfare, but the modality warfare fluctuates in the continuum that we're talking about. So when we say, can we achieve peace with Azerbaijan? Or should at some point, for example, a peace treaty be signed? Do we have peace with Azerbaijan? And the point that I'm trying to make is that, we need to understand what we mean by this concept. By virtue of signing a document, we might not, for example, have the wide-scale war that we use to qualify a peaceful period. That may be curtailed, but it's not going to stop Azerbaijan's Cold War behavior. It's not going to stop their hybrid activities. Matter of fact, research suggests that their hybrid activities will be amplified, because during periods of so-called peace where treaties have been signed, gray zone tactics are utilized more, because it allows for some level of culpable deniability. And so when we talk about this concept, right, what do we mean by it? We need to understand what peace means. If we're going to say, listen, anything short of a full-scale war is peace for us, then that's what we'll proceed with. Okay, but if we're seeing peace as the relations that we have with Georgia, right, which are peaceful and there are no continuous threats or problems, then obviously will be that would be a very misleading conceptualization of the phenomenon. My argument is that we're never going to have a level of peace with Azerbaijan if we qualify it through a sort of a thing, an absolute sense. Our relations with Azerbaijan, even after whatever is signed down the line, or if it is signed, you're going to have a mitigation of hot war, but you're not going to have any mitigation of a cold war that's going to be continuous. So this is what I talk about. In the asymmetrical realm, you're not going to have peace. And we need to better understand how we qualify the concept so we're not misleading ourselves into thinking, well, we signed the peace treaty. Why does Azerbaijan continue with these activities that don't look very peaceful? And that's precisely the point that I was making.
Okay, so then you talk about dehybridization. Refers to building resilience against the antagonistic state's abilities, in this case Azerbaijan's abilities, by engaging in deterrence by denial. Now, I read that section several times, and you're saying dehybridization is not about deterrence as punishment, but as noted, deterrence by denial. How does Armenia achieve this?
So this concept was developed after Russia's 2014 absorption of Crimea. And so the literature on asymmetrical warfare and hybrid warfare, in a lot of the scholarship in military circles, tried to find a solution. And the solution was dehybridization. This has been very well developed in various military academies in the West, especially in the Scandinavian countries that are small, vulnerable countries that cannot engage in the same level of hybrid warfare. Therefore, they engage in dehybridization. What this entails is you develop safeguards of resilience, when hybrid warfare is utilized against you, you deny the effectiveness of it. So you don't engage in the same level of counter responses, but rather you deem the operations or activities of the opponent or the antagonistic state as ineffective. So if, for example, Azerbaijan's caviar diplomacy doesn't work, or if their cyber activities don't work, or if their information warfare doesn't work, those have been proven to be ineffective. That is dehybridization. Now, dehybridization doesn't entail that Armenia goes on the offensive and starts engaging in cyber warfare or whatever, but that's a separate component. So deterrence by denial basically means the given antagonistic country's utilization of hybrid warfare has been deemed ineffective. It's been denied. So by virtue of realizing that their operations aren't working, their hybrid capacities have been denied. Deterrence by punishment entails taking countermeasures to punish them. And so that is a whole different realm. And so in the realm of asymmetry, where you don't have equal powers, you can deny the capabilities of a more resourceful, wealthier state by engaging in dehybridization. Or whether you undertake hybrid activities against that state, that's a question of resources. When you have an asymmetrical disparity, it's preferable to dehybridize and engage in deterrence by denial.
Right, but in that case, Armenia doesn't have any agency. If
Well,
caviar diplomacy isn't working, it's not working. If cyber warfare isn't working, it's not working. What are the steps that Armenia should take, or does take, or will take?
Agency just does not have a well-developed hybrid doctrine. This is the question. So, for example, if Armenia's hybrid doctrine, very much like the Swedes, like the Finns, is defined by dehybridization, then you would develop a mechanism where which Azerbaijan's activities become ineffective and they don't have the same effect. So diplomatization is one component of it. So for example, how do you battle caviar diplomacy? That's where diplomatic techniques come in. How do you combat cyber attacks? That's where enhancing your cyber defenses come in. How do you fight the information war, et cetera, et cetera. So these are defensive postures where it deems the opponent ineffective. We do have agency. We just don't have a hybrid warfare policy of dehybridization. Once that's developed, then it can be implemented. And so at this point, right, whereas the opponent, by virtue of having an asymmetrical thing, advantage over you, has a policy it's implementing, and you don't, that's not a question of agency, it's a question of disparity.
Okay, so you keep talking about deterrence, which is what we spoke about earlier, and in the September EVN Security Report, where you were talking about Armenia's deterrence or lack or absence of deterrence capabilities and how important it is to elevate those. And now we're talking about taking defensive measures in this hybrid or dehybridization of Azerbaijan's tactics. When is it, in your estimation, perhaps this is an unfair question, I'm not sure, at what point does Armenia stop elevating deterrence and its defensive postures and start moving toward other kinds of activities? Because at this point, we're all constantly on the defensive.
Well, fundamentally, all of these objectives are designed to create deterrence. Deterrence basically means that you become so effective in your defenses that it makes no sense for the opponent to attack you. Therefore, you have deterred them from aggression. Right now, we don't have sufficient deterrence capabilities, which gives Azerbaijan the level of power that it gives them to undertake operations or to pressure us, so on and so forth. So it is the lack of deterrence capability that is the determining factor in explaining Azerbaijan's behavior. How do you move from that, right? And this is what we're talking about. So hybrid warfare doctrine or dehybridization techniques is one modality of deterrence, but that is one concept of it. A diplomatization of security is another mechanism of deterrence, but none of these in and of themselves are sufficient or absolute. This is why we speak of a security architecture, which has a multitude of components and not a singular component, because a singular component cannot be a solution. So between a hybrid warfare doctrine, diplomatization of security, and enhancing hard power capabilities, this is where you develop sufficient deterrence capabilities. What Armenia lacks are hard power capabilities. And this goes back to our discussion of the issue we had in our September edition, is because our security architecture was one of dependency. Instead of having sufficient hard power capabilities to deter the enemy, we said, no, reliance on Russia would deter the enemy. But once it's collapsed, we are now in the stage of developing a new deterrence policy and a security policy. Also, we have to understand that what kind of deterrence do we want to engage in? Deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment? So if we're talking about, for example, having hybrid capacities, diplomatic capacities, and hard power capacities, right? What kind of hard power capacities are you talking about? Ones where you have some sufficient amount of power that will make it too costly for the enemy to attack? Or are we talking about having such a level of power capacity that not only do we deter them, but we can also engage in advancing behavior as well and to go on the offensive? So these are the conversations. Obviously, conversations of going on the offensive and deterrence by punishment are unrealistic right now. This is why we talk about deterrence by denial. The objective isn't at this point to punish Azerbaijan. That's just unrealistic. It's a preference, but it's not attainable. But deterrence by denial is attainable. And this is the conversation that we're having.
Nerses, just as a couple of final questions to wrap up, and I would really encourage people who are listening to sit down with the security report and really try to absorb all of the very important points that you're making. So in September, we saw that diplomacy as security, or the diplomatization of security, worked relatively well because it was able to deter Azerbaijan from any other further incursions, aside from the occasional shooting at Armenian military positions. And now we're talking about denial of, the hybrid warfare tactics that Azerbaijan is using and what Armenia needs to do. These two things, all of these things have to run parallel, like you said, with increasing our actual hard capacities. Moving forward with the discussions taking place with the West, with Russia, with Putin's latest announcements that we welcome Armenia's decision on which route it chooses to follow. What do you foresee happening in the next few months or the next few weeks even?
At this point, there's a general understanding that the West is providing quite a bit of pressure on both parties to sign some kind of a peace agreement because the continuous threat of conflict is not a tenable position for the West. It also creates a lot of resource-intense issues for the West, where they have to keep thinking about conflict, keep thinking about establishing a ceasefire, keep thinking about maintaining the quote-unquote relative peace. And so all those factors are contributing. Russia's position has been a little different. Russia is suggesting, yes, peace is important. We want to establish some configuration of it, but we want to do that at this point without addressing the issue of Artsakh. So you have one that has a holistic, quote unquote, holistic attempt at doing a package peace deal, while the other is saying, let's have a general peace deal, but leave out one important issue because that issue is so complex it cannot be addressed right now. Both sound good on paper, because everybody wants a level of peace, especially in society. But what are the implications of this? Okay, what are the consequences of this? If we assume the Western proposal, yes, peace sounds great, but what happens to the population of Artsakh? What guarantees are being provided? For all means and purposes, Artsakh right now is mostly a Russian colony as far as its protection is concerned, and Yerevan has very little agency. So what happens to this population? So the Western proposition has a lot of things that need to be ironed out. The Russian proposal also has serious issues. We saw since 1994 the continuous prolonging of a status quo brought us to catastrophe, right? So if we keep kicking the can down the road as far as Artsakh is concerned, what are going to be the implications of this? So both the proposals need to address fundamentally the security dilemma faced by the Artsakh Armenians. If that is not going to be cogently addressed, this discussion of a peace package becomes incoherent. So at the end of the day, what are we talking about? The global community understands that Azerbaijan is clearly transgressing into Armenia proper, but this is tied to the Artsakh issue. So one side is saying, what we need to do in the next month or two, right? There's this very rushed approach to addressing some kind of a finalized agreement by the end of the year, right? One side is saying, listen, let's have a package deal. Let's come to a conclusion. Let's establish peace. Let's have economic trade, and this through time will solve the problems, and you have a peaceful region. And the issue of Artsakh would need to be addressed accordingly, but we haven't seen any solutions there. What's going to look like, what the security architecture of the indigenous Armenian population is going to look like. The other side is saying, the Russian perspective is, yes, we need to have peace, Russians will secure the population of Artsakh for the time being, and then we'll decide what happens. The issue is that we'll decide what happens continues to perpetuate the dependency structure. And that in of itself is also not a sufficient solution. So both dynamics come fundamentally down to one point. Whose proposition provides a sufficient, not a generic one, but a sufficient concrete security to the Armenian population. And based on that, then we could say whether it's the so-called Western proposal or the Moscow proposal, that's going to be more acceptable. But we have not seen any specifics, any nuances on the security of Artsakh people from either side. One is very vague, and the other wants to kick the can down the road.
Right. Well, certainly there are no easy decisions, no easy choices, no easy alternatives at this moment. But Nerses, thank you for the conversation, to trying to explain these sometimes complex and sometimes seemingly simple terms. And because the situation is so fluid, every day brings some kind of new nuance to the discussion. We look forward to seeing your November security briefing. Hopefully, even though you said that peace at this point is difficult to see in the immediate or in the distant future even, hopefully there will be relative peace next month, and we look forward to your next briefing. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.